Hey guys, it's Will from the Game Lounge here, and today we're going to be looking at 20 impossible ports, games that had no right running on their hardware, tastefully reworking games to fit the lower hardware constraints. Now, these are my 20 games. I want to hear in the comments if you think I've missed a game, or if there's a port that you think is particularly special. Let me know. Let's get started. Super Monkey Ball for the Game Boy Advance was actually a faithful port of the GameCube version. Despite the GBA's rudimentary 3D system, but what is incredible is that this game actually was the entire GameCube game on the hardware. And what's even more interesting to me is the fact that it captures that sense of momentum even without the GameCube's analog stick, managing to do something pretty special with the GBA D-pad despite the low frame rate. It's obsolete now, but the fact that the entire game here turns up in a playable state, I think is pretty incredible. Can it run Crysis? A PC Master Race slogan from the 2007 game release for the best part of a decade. Now, when Crytek said that they were going to convert Crysis in 2011 to the 2005 Xbox 360 and PS3 hardware, few thought it would be possible. But utilizing CryEngine 3, which was optimized for those systems, and making the effort of overhauling a number of textures, as well as a revamped lighting model and shadows, made this have a look very, very comparable to the PC killing original. And they were able to achieve a very pleasing result on hardware that, if we remember, predated Crysis by a year. If you haven't tried this one, it's definitely worth a look. Doom on the SNES can be perhaps considered one of the earliest impossible ports. Now, the game had to run on incredibly inferior hardware and did this with a few concessions. For example, all enemies only have front-facing sprites. In other words, they can't turn. But this is something I didn't even really notice in the heat of battle until I was looking closely replaying this game. You'll also notice if you look that the ceiling and the floor are not textured at all, they're just flat planes, and that's just due to memory constraints within the system. But overall, this is Doom running a 16-bit system and really brings the experience. If you had no other way to play Doom, this was phenomenal 30 years ago when it came out, and it's still impressive from a technological standpoint today. The Street Fighter series was relaunched with Street Fighter 4, and the 3DS port was an incredible one because it featured zero concessions, all of the content is there, and incredibly, the game performed as well as its console counterpart, albeit at a slightly lower resolution. In addition, there was 3D implemented in here, and the touchscreen supers were a nice touch. Handheld gaming certainly didn't mean a smaller feature set with this one. Outrun for the PSP was originally a game built on the Xbox Sega Chihiro hardware that was scaled down to fit onto the PSP handheld system. What's impressive is this is not a reduced version. The entire game is here. Yes, the frame rate has a few hiccups and some of the texture quality has been tastefully down-sampled, but for a 2006 handheld game, this is an incredible effort. And even with the PSP nub, the control accurately reworked for the PSP. This was a reason to own the PSP back in the day, and was incredible to see this game on the go, and in fact was one of the games that I purchased alongside the Xbox version. Killer Instinct was a conversion of the arcade game to the SNES, and is one of the most graphically impressive games on the system. Now, the graphic detail had to be reduced and character sprites made smaller than its arcade counterpart, and stages with 3D panning were simplified into 2D sprites using parallax scrolling for the background and a raster effect for the ground effect. But it simulated a fantastic pseudo 3D effect. Zooming and scaling were taken out and some of the stages had to be redesigned, but this is an incredibly impressive port for the hardware. In fact, some modes were even added, including a training mode and tournament mode for multiplayer purposes. It looks great, and if you haven't played this version, definitely take a look. Hydro Thunder from Midway was originally an arcade game that was released on consoles on the Sega Dreamcast. They then released a downscaled version for the Nintendo 64, but incredibly they also put out a version for the aging Sony PlayStation hardware. Now what's pretty incredible here is the fact that they managed to retain, by downsampling and removing some of the polygons, they changed some of the water effects, but actually managed to retain the look of the game. They even added in a career mode, and I think the whole thing, due to the color palette and the use of primary color, ends up looking incredibly pleasing. The game is still a blast to play. Yes, the frame rate can drop compared to the Dreamcast version, but it's one of the underrated racing games on the system. If you have missed this for some reason, I definitely recommend you take a look at this, even just for curiosity. Call of Duty Modern Warfare landed on the Nintendo Wii 2 years after the original 360 and PS3 versions, and whilst World at War, the first Call of Duty game, was a fairly sloppy, unoptimized mess with muddy textures, this version ran far more smoothly, looked better, and was a full conversion of the 360 version, with carefully considered Wii controls that to me really add something. Okay, you're not going to move with the same fluidity as a standard controller, but it works really well, and this is a really fun way to play this game even now. It looks fantastic for the time, and just for curiosity for the controls, you should take a look at this one. Virtua Racing came to arcades and blew everybody's mind with its fantastic, smooth 3D visuals. Now, if you'd have said to me the chance of Sega converting this to the 1988 Genesis hardware, I would have laughed, but via the use of an additional chip in the cart, the SVP chip, Sega was able to create a version of the game which, at home in 1995, was pretty incredible to see. It played pretty well. Yes, it's the worst version of this game, but to be able to take this home, yes, it was a premium cartridge. It cost £70. To be able to have this arcade experience at home in 1994 was pretty incredible. Rayman II was originally a game released on the Nintendo 64 and had ports to the Dreamcast and upgraded versions on the PC, and even a PS2 version which added a lot of new content. And post all of these versions, Ubisoft announced that they were creating a version for the original PlayStation. Now, many areas are cut and some of the visuals and textures are scaled down, but the game looks extremely impressive and actually manages to port some things from the PS2 version and even add some exclusive content such as ninjas. Overall, it looks phenomenal and plays extremely well. So this is definitely a game for the PlayStation that really shouldn't have existed. Getting the 2016 reboot of Doom to run on hardware comparable to that of the previous generation may seem impossible, but despite the cutbacks, and let's be clear, there are many here, reduced frame rate, lower quality textures, and struggling to ever get anywhere near a 720p resolution, the game implemented a very easy on the eye motion blur, which, when you look at these images at a glance, disguises many of the rough edges. The fact that this is running also on a low-powered portable system, in my opinion, is nothing short of remarkable and truly a testament to the quality of the developer panic button. Virtua Fighter 2 was a conversion of the Model 2 Sega arcade platform. Now, following the disappointing conversion of the original Virtua Fighter, a Model 1 game, I don't think people held out an awful lot of hope for this version. However, by this time, Sega had got far more comfortable with the Saturn's hardware, and the two processors, the VDP-1 and 2, utilizing the infinite planes as well as 2D backgrounds, they managed to create a game which looked every bit as good as the arcade counterpart, and considering the Model 2 hardware was significantly more advanced, this really is an impressive feat. Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn is still a fun game to play to this day. The Witcher 3 on the Nintendo Switch is an incredible achievement. Okay, the resolution is low and the textures are muddy and overall draw distance is not great, but the game was built to focus on bringing The Witcher to a handheld, and these concessions are definitely not as noticeable on the smaller screen. What is impressive here is that they managed to port the entire game with all of the DLC packed onto a 32GB cart, so no huge downloads when you initially tried to play the game. There's no reduction in the amount of NPCs, and this wasn't just the PC version ported over. A lot of care and attention went into making sure that the game actually has a pretty stable 30 frames per second. If you haven't played The Witcher on the go, the Switch may not be the best way to do it now with the Steam Deck and Asus ROG Ally, but overall, it's still a very, very impressive achievement indeed.
Siri, cut it.
Half-Life 2 is a game that needs no introduction, and it's a game that revolutionized physics in the first-person shooter. But in 2005, a port was brought to the original Xbox, a system with far lower specs than even the minimum requirements on a PC. Textures were scaled down and resolution was lowered, and Valve used a very clever streaming system to ensure that the large levels that were loaded into memory in the PC version were carefully streamed in and out of memory, and also adjusted the lighting mechanism to use an approximated version of what was on the PC. The result was the entire Half-Life 2 game ported to the original Xbox and looks incredible. Rise of the Tomb Raider was Lara Croft's introduction to the 8th generation of console hardware on the Xbox One. When you see this image, though, what you don't realize is that this is from hardware from the 2005 Xbox 360. Now, concessions were made. As always, the game runs at a lower 720p resolution, texture detail and color depth is reduced, and cutscenes used were pre-recorded videos based on the Xbox One version. They also took computationally expensive processes like the TressFX for the hair and utilized the original version from the Tomb Raider 2013 reboot. But when you see the image here, it's hard to believe that this is running on nearly 20-year-old hardware now. What they were able to do and produce still looks good to this day, and playing it again was a real pleasure. If you haven't seen Rise of the Tomb Raider on the 360, it's worth a look just to appreciate the technology and effort alone. Quake II on the original PlayStation is a hell of an achievement. They redesigned the entire game engine from scratch, and it was able to achieve a mostly smooth 30 frames per second. As with so many games on this list, concessions were made, mostly in the form of loading times, as entire levels could not be loaded into the PlayStation's smaller memory. But Hammerhead Studios, who created this game, were incredibly clever in how they were able to reconstruct certain levels to work around these memory constraints very intelligently. They even were able to scale this game so that it worked with a 4-player multiplayer mode with no real drop in quality, seeing as Quake II was a system that utilized the latest 3DFX versions running on the 1994 PlayStation hardware in the year 2000 was incredibly impressive indeed. Originally a CPS2 arcade game, Capcom managed to bring Street Fighter Alpha 2, a game with a huge amount of sprite animations, to the SNES. Now, considering in 1996, Capcom greenlit this project to convert the game to the aging SNES in its twilight years, it's pretty impressive this ever even got off the ground, but it was certainly a passion project from the developers. They did this by utilizing a special SDD1 chip within the cart, which essentially allowed them to store a far higher number of sprites and textures and allowed that to be compressed to run. Otherwise, this would not have happened. And when you see the game here, it's hard to imagine this is running on a SNES console. So each game on this list so far is an incredible impossible port due to primarily hardware limitations. Resident Evil 2 on the Nintendo 64 is a slightly different story because the Nintendo 64 easily had the power to compete with the PlayStation. However, this is more of a storage solution issue. Originally, Resident Evil 2 on PlayStation released on 2 discs, containing a total of over a gigabyte of data, and they had to make it fit onto the highest capacity 64 megabyte cart. Now, the developer managed to do this with all the FMV videos intact due to some impressive compression techniques using N64 hardware and reducing the resolution of certain background images when there are zombies on the screen and perhaps you're not paying such close attention to the background, as well as recreating the sound using the Nintendo 64's RSP chip. Overall, it's a remarkable achievement to get this game on to the Nintendo 64. And if you want to see more about this, I recommend you check out Modern Vintage Gamer's video, which has a lot more detail on this port. It's very, very interesting indeed. Taking the number 2 spot is another Xbox PC conversion, Doom 3, and the reason that I rate this higher than the Half-Life conversion was this really did require very, very high-end PC specs, and the Xbox was far lower than the PC target hardware, and also what they were able to do to get this port working. Lighting was downsampled, and some of the more GPU intensive processes from the PC version, such as hit detection, were replaced with less CPU intensive equivalents. And also they very, very cleverly utilized the Xbox's built-in storage in order to cache textures and make subtle changes to the level design in order to actually get Doom onto the Xbox. Overall, it's an extremely impressive conversion and still looks and plays well today. So what is the game I perhaps consider to be the most impossible of all the impossible ports? And it has to be Quake on the Sega Saturn. Now, part of this is the Saturn was not considered a 3D machine. Quake at the time was considered the upper echelon of 3DFX graphics, looking incredible and utilizing the latest modern PC techniques. And yet, Lobotomy Software was able to create the Power Slave engine, which essentially was able to, they couldn't convert it in its raw form, they had to rebuild using new techniques from scratch. But not only that, they were able to in many ways surpass the PC original with some of the great lighting effects and really, really utilize the Saturn's unique hardware. What it ended up being was an incredibly playable full version of the game. And whilst it may not be the preferable way to play the game today, it still impresses me every single time I go back to this version. I hope you enjoyed the video as always. Please like, please subscribe, and definitely comment with games that maybe you think are impossible ports. I'll see you soon.